Chapter 47 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Which is rather interesting. Mr. Vanslyperken's retreat was not known to the crew. They thought him still on deck, and he hastened forward to secrete himself even from his own crew, who were not a little astonished at this unexpected attack, which they could not account for. The major part of the arms on board were always kept in Mr. Vanslyperken's cabin, and that was not only in possession of the assailants, but there was a strong guard in the passage outside, which led to the lower deck. "Well, this beats my comprehension entirely," said Bill Spurey. "Yes," replied Short. "And mine too," added Obadiah Coble, "being as we are, as you know, at peace with all nations, to be boarded and carried in this way. Why, what and who can they be?" "I've a notion that Vanslyperken's at the bottom of it," replied Spurey. "Yes," said Short. "But it's a bottom that I can't fathom," continued Spurey. "My dipsy line aren't long enough either," replied Coble. "God for dam, what it can be!" exclaimed Jansen. "It must be the treason." "Mein Gott, yes," replied Corporal Van Spitter. "It is all treason, and the traitor be Vanslyperken." But although the corporal had some confused ideas, still he could not yet arrange them. "Well, I've no notion of being boxed up here," observed Coble. "They can't be so many as we are, even if they were stowed away in the boat like pilchards in a cask. Can't we get at the arms, corporal, and make a rush for it?" "Mein Gott, the arms are all in the cabin, all but 3 pair pistols and the bayonets." "Well, but we've handspikes," observed Spurey. "God for dam, give me the handspike," cried Jansen. "We had better wait till daylight at all events," observed Coble. "We shall see our work better." "Yes," replied Short. "And in the meantime, get everything to hand that we can." "Yes," replied Short. "Well, I can't understand the manoeuvre. It beats my comprehension what they have done with Vanslyperken." "I don't know, but they've kicked the cur out of the cabin." "Then they've kicked him out too, depend upon it." Thus did the crew continue to surmise during the whole night, but, as Bill Spurey said, the manoeuvre beat their comprehension. One thing was agreed upon, that they should make an attempt to recover the vessel as soon as they could. In the meantime, Ramsay, with Wilhelmina and the Jesuits, had taken possession of the cabin, and had opened all the despatches which acquainted them with the directions in detail given for the taking of the conspirators at Portsmouth and in the cave. Had it not been to save his friends, Ramsay would at once have taken the cutter to Cherbourg, and have there landed Wilhelmina and the treasure. But his anxiety for his friends determined him to run at once for the cave, and send overland to Portsmouth. The wind was fair and the water smooth, and before morning the cutter was on her way. In the meantime the crew of the cutter had not been idle. The ladders had been taken up and hatches closed. The only chance of success was an attack upon the guard, who was stationed outside of the cabin. They had 6 pistols, about 200 pounds of ammunition, but, with the exception of half a dozen bayonets, no other weapons. But they were resolute men, and as soon as they had made their arrangements, which consisted of piling up their hammocks so as to make a barricade to fire over, they then commenced operations, the first signal of which was a pistol shot discharged at the men who were on guard in the passage, and which wounded one of them. Ramsay darted out of the cabin at the report of the pistol. Another and another was discharged, and Ramsay then gave the order to fire in return. This was done, but without injury to the seamen of the cutter, who were protected by the hammocks, and Ramsay, having already 3 of his men wounded, found that the post below was no longer tenable. A consultation took place, and it was determined that the passage on the lower deck and the cabin should be abandoned, as the upper deck would be easy to retain. The cabin's skylight was taken off, and the boxes of gold handed up, while the party outside the cabin door maintained the conflict with the crew of the Jungfrau. When all the boxes were up, Wilhelmina was lifted on deck, the skylight was shipped on again, and as soon as the after hatches were ready to put on, Ramsay's men retreated at the ladder, which they drew up after them, and then put on the hatches. Had not the barricade of hammocks prevented them, the crew of the Jungfrau might have made a rush and followed the others on deck, but before they could beat down the barricades, which they did as soon as they perceived their opponent's retreat, the ladder was up, and the hatches placed over the hatchways. The Jungfraus had gained the whole of the lower deck, but they could do no more, and Ramsay perceived that if he could maintain possession of the upper deck, it was as much as he could expect with such determined assailants. This warfare had been continued during the whole morning, and it was 12 o'clock before the cabin and lower deck had been abandoned by Ramsay's associates. During the whole day the skirmishes continued, the crew of the Jungfrau climbing on the table of the cabin and firing through the skylight, but in so doing they exposed themselves to the fire of the other party, who sat like cats watching for their appearance, and discharging their pieces the moment that a head presented itself. In the meantime the cutter darted on before a strong favourable breeze, and thus passed the first day. Many attempts were made during the night by the seamen of the cutter to force their way on deck, but they were all prevented by the vigilance of Ramsay, and the next morning the Isle of Wight was in sight. Wilhelmina had passed the night on the forecastle, covered up with a sail. None of his people had had anything to eat during the time that they were on board, and Ramsay was most anxious to arrive at his destination. About noon the cutter was abreast of the Black Gang Shine. Ramsay had calculated upon retaining possession of the cutter, and taking the whole of the occupants of the cave over to Cherbourg, but this was now impossible. He had 5 of his men wounded, and he could not row the boat to the cave without leaving so few men on board that they would be overpowered, for his ammunition was expended, with the exception of 1 or 2 charges which were retained for an emergency. All that he could now do was therefore to put his treasure in the boat, and with Wilhelmina and his whole party make for the cave, when he could send notice to Portsmouth for the others to join them, and they must be content to await the meditated attack upon the cave, and defend it till they could make their escape to France. The wind being foul for the cutter's return to Portsmouth, would enable him to give notice at Portsmouth, overland, before she could arrive. There was a great oversight committed when the lower deck was abandoned. The despatches had been left on Mr Vanslyperken's bed. Had they been taken away or destroyed, there would have been ample time for the whole of his party to have made their escape from England before duplicates could arrive. As it was, he could do no more than what we have already mentioned. The boat was hauled up, the boxes of specie put in, the wounded men laid at the bottom of the boat, and, having, at the suggestion of one of the men, cut the lower riggings, halyards, etc., of the cutter to retard its progress to Portsmouth, Ramsay and his associates stepped into the boat and pulled for the cave. Their departure was soon ascertained by the crew of the Jungfrau, who now forced the skylight and gained the deck, but not before the boat had entered the cave. "What's to be done now?" said Coble. "Smash my timbers, but they've played old Harry with the rigging. We must knot and splice." "Yes," replied Short. "What the devil have they done with Vanslyperken?" cried Bill Spurey. "Either shoved him overboard, or taken him with them, I suppose," cried Coble. "Well, it's a nice job altogether," observed Spurey. "Mein Gott, yes," replied the corporal. "We will have a pretty story to tell the admiral." "Well, they've rid us of him at all events. I only hope they'll hang him." "Mein Gott, yes." "He'll have his deserts," replied Coble. "Gott for Tom, I'd like to see him swing." "Now he's gone, let's send his dog after him. Hurrah, my lads! Get a rope up on the yard, and let us hang Snarleyyow." "Mein Gott, I'll go fetch him," cried the corporal. "You will you?" roared a voice. The corporal turned round, so did the others, and there, with his drawn sword, stood Mr Vanslyperken. "You damned mutinous scoundrel!" cried Vanslyperken. "Touch my dog if you dare." The corporal put his hand up to the salute, and Vanslyperken shook his head with a diabolical expression of countenance. "Now where the devil could he come from?" whispered Spurey. Coble shrugged up his shoulders, and Short gave a long whistle, expending more breath than usual. However, there was no more to be said, and as soon as the rigging was knotted and spliced, sail was made on the cutter. But the wind being dead in their teeth, they did not arrive until late the next evening, and the admiral did not see the despatches till the next morning, for the best of all possible reasons, that Vanslyperken did not take them on shore. He had a long story to tell, and he thought it prudent not to disturb the admiral after dinner, as great men are apt to be very choleric during the process of digestion. The consequence was, that when, the next morning, Mr Vanslyperken called upon the admiral, the intelligence had been received from the cave, and all the parties had absconded. Mr Vanslyperken told his own tale, how he had been hailed by a boat purporting to have a messenger on board, how they had boarded him, and beat down himself and his crew, how he and his crew had fought under hatches, and beat them on deck, and how they had been forced to abandon the cutter. All this was very plausible, and then Vanslyperken gave the despatches opened by Ramsay. The admiral read them in haste, gave immediate orders for surrounding and breaking into the house of the Jew Lazarus, in which the military found nobody but an old tomcat, and then desired Mr Vanslyperken to hold the cutter in readiness to embark troops and sail that afternoon. But troops do not move so fast as people think, and before 100 men had been told off by the sergeant, with their accoutrements, knapsacks, and 60 pounds of ammunition, it was too late to embark them that night, so they waited until the next morning. Moreover, Mr Vanslyperken had orders to draw from the dockyard 3 large boats for the debarkation of the said troops, but the boats were not quite ready. One required a new gunwale, another 3 planks in the bottom, and the third having her stern out, it required all the carpenters in the yard to finish it by the next morning. Mr Vanslyperken's orders were to proceed to the cave and land the troops, to march up to the cave, and to cover the advance of the troops, rendering them all the assistance in his power in co-operating with the major commanding the detachment. But where the cave was, no one knew, except that it was thereabouts. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, the detachment, consisting of 100 men, were embarked on board of the cutter, but the major commandant, finding that the decks were excessively crowded, and that he could hardly breathe, ordered section 1st, section 2nd, and section 3rd, of 25 men each, to go into the boats and be towed, after which there was more room, and the cutter stood out for St. Helens. End of chapter 47. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 48 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, in which there is a great deal of correspondence, and the widow is called up very early in the morning. We must now return to Mynheer Krause, who, after he had delivered over his gold, locked up his counting-house, and went up to the saloon, determining to meet his fate with all the dignity of a Roman senator. He sent for his daughter, who sent word back that she was packing up her wardrobe, and this answer appeared but reasonable to the syndic, who, therefore, continued in his chair, reflecting upon his approaching incarceration, conning speeches, and anticipating a glorious acquittal, until the bell of the cathedral chimed the half-hour after 10. He then sent another message to his daughter, and the reply was that she was not in the room, upon which he dispatched old Coops to Ramsay, requesting his attendance. The reply to this second message was a letter presented to the syndic, who broke the seal and read as follows: My dear and honoured Sir, I have sought a proper asylum for your daughter during the impending troubles, and could not find one which pleased, and in consequence I have taken the bold step, aware that I might not have received your sanction if applied for, of taking her on board the cutter with me. She will there be safe, and as her character might be, to a certain degree, impeached by being in company with a man of my age, I intend, as soon as we arrive in port, to unite myself to her, for which act, I trust, you will grant me your pardon. As for yourself, be under no apprehension. I have saved you. Treat the accusation with scorn, and if you are admitted into the presence of his Majesty, accuse him of the ingratitude which he has been guilty of. I trust that we shall soon meet again, and that I may return to you the securities and specie of which I have charge, as well as your daughter, who is anxious once more to receive your blessing. Yours ever till death, Edward Ramsay. Mynheer Krause read this letter over and over again. It was very mystifying. Much depends in this world upon the humour people are in at the time. Mynheer Krause was, at that time, full of Cato-like devotion and Roman virtue, and he took the contents of the letter in true Catonic style. Excellent young man, to preserve my honour he has taken her away with him, and to preserve her reputation he intends to marry her. Now I can go to prison without a sigh. He tells me that he has saved me. Saved me! Why, he has saved everything. Me, my daughter, and my property. Well, they shall see how I behave. They shall witness the calmness of a stoic. I shall express no emotion or surprise at the arrest, as they will naturally expect, because I know it is to take place. No fear, no agitation when in prison, because I know that I am to be saved. I shall desire them to bear in mind that I am the syndic of this town, and must receive that respect which is due to my exalted situation. And Mynheer Van Krause lifted his pipe and ordered Coops to bring him a stone jug of beer, and thus doubly armed, like Cato, he awaited the arrival of the officer with all the stoicism of beer and tobacco. About the same hour of night that the letter was put into the hands of Mynheer Krause, a packet was brought up to Lord Albemarle, who was playing a game of put with his Grace the Duke of Portland. At that time put was a most fashionable game, but games are like garments, as they become old they are cast off and handed down to the servants. The outside of the despatch was marked, "To Lord Albemarle's own hands," immediate and most important. It appeared, however, as if the two noble lords considered the game of put as more important and immediate, for they finished it without looking at the packet in question, and it was midnight before they threw up the cards. after which Lord Albemarle went to a side table apart from the rest of the company, and broke the seals. It was a letter with enclosures, and ran as follows: My Lord Albemarle, although your political enemy, I do justice to your merits, and to prove my opinion of you, address to you this letter, the object of which is to save your government from the disgrace of injuring a worthy man and a staunch supporter, to expose the villainy of a coward and a scoundrel. When I state that my name is Ramsay, you may at once be satisfied that, before this comes to your hands, I am out of your reach. I came here in the king's cutter, commanded by Mr Vanslyperken, with letters of recommendation to Mynheer Krause, which represented me as a staunch adherent of William of Orange, and a Protestant, and, with that impression, I was well received, and took up my abode in his house. My object you may imagine, but fortune favoured me still more in having in my power Lieutenant Vanslyperken. I opened the government despatches in his presence, and supplied him with false seals to enable him to do the same, and give me the extracts which were of importance, for which I hardly need say he was most liberally rewarded. This has been carried on for some time, but it appears that in showing him how to obtain your secrets, I also showed him how to possess himself of ours, and the consequence has been that he has turned double traitor, and I have now narrowly escaped. The information possessed by Mynheer Krause was given by me, to win his favour, for one simple reason, that I fell in love with his daughter, who has now quitted the country with me. He never was undeceived as to my real position, nor is he even now. Let me do an honest man justice. I enclose you the extracts from your duplicates made by Mr Vanslyperken, written in his own hand, which I trust will satisfy you as to his perfidy, and induce you to believe in the innocence of the worthy syndic, from the assurance of a man, who, although a Catholic, a Jacobite, and, if you please, an attainted traitor, is incapable of telling you a falsehood. I am, my lord, with every respect for your noble character, yours most obediently, Edward Ramsay. This is corroboration of my suspicions, said Lord Albemarle, putting down the papers before the Duke of Portland. The Duke read the letter and examined the enclosures. Shall we see the king to-night? No, he is retired, and it is of no use. They are in prison by this time. We will wait the report to-morrow morning, ascertain how many have been secured, and then lay these documents before his Majesty. Leaving the two noble lords to go to bed, we shall now return to Amsterdam at 12 o'clock at night precisely. As the bell tolled, a loud knock was heard at the syndic's house. Coop, who had been ordered by his master to remain up, immediately opened the door, and a posse comitatus of civil power filled the yard. Where is Mynheer Krause? inquired the chief in authority. Mynheer the syndic is upstairs in the saloon. Without sending up his name, the officer went up, followed by 3 or 4 others, and found Mynheer Krause smoking his pipe. Ah, my very particular friend, Mynheer Engelback. What brings you here at this late hour with all of your people? Is there a fire in the town? No, Mynheer Syndic. It is an order, I am very sorry to say, to arrest you and conduct you to prison. Arrest and conduct me to prison? Me, the syndic of the town? That is strange. Will you allow me to see your warrant? Yes, it is all true and countersigned by his Majesty. I have no more to say, Mynheer Engelback. As syndic of this town and administrator of the laws, it is my duty to set the example of obedience to them, at the same time protesting my entire innocence. Coops, get me my mantle. Mynheer Engelback, I claim to be treated with the respect due to me as syndic of this town. The officers were not a little staggered at the coolness and sang-froid of Mynheer Krause. He had never appeared to so much advantage. They bowed respectfully as he finished his speech. "I believe, Mynheer Krause, that you have some friends staying with you?" "I have no friend in the house except my very particular friend, Mynheer Engelback," replied the syndic. "You must excuse us, but we must search the house." "You have his Majesty's warrant so to do, and no excuse is necessary." After a diligent search of half an hour, nobody was found in the house, and the officers began to suspect that the government had been imposed upon. Mynheer Krause, with every mark of attention and respect, was then walked off to the Hôtel de Ville, where he remained in custody, for it was not considered right by the authorities that the syndic should be thrown into the common prison upon suspicion only. When he arrived there, Mynheer Krause surprised them all by the philosophy with which he smoked his pipe. But although there was nobody to be found except the syndic in the syndic's house, and not a soul at the house inhabited by the Jesuit, there was one more person included in the warrant, who was the widow Vandersloosh, for Lord Albemarle, although convinced in his own mind of her innocence, could not take upon himself to interfere with the decisions of the council. So about 1 o'clock there was a loud knocking at the widow's door, which was repeated again and again before it awoke the widow, who was fatigued with her long and hot journey to the Hague. As for Babette, she made a rule never to awake at anything but the magical number 6, sounded by the church clock by her mistress's voice. "Babette!" cried the widow Vandersloosh. "Babette!" "Yes, ma'am." "There's a knock at the door, Babette." "Only some drunken sailors, ma'am. They go away when they find they cannot get in." Here the peals were redoubled. "Babette, get up, Babette, and threaten them with the watch." "Yes, ma'am," replied Babette, with a terrible yawn. Knocking and thumping with strokes louder than before. "Babette, Babette!" "I must put something on, ma'am," replied Babette, rather crossly. "Speak to them out of the window, Babette." Here poor Babette came down to the first floor, and opening the window at the landing place on the stairs, put her head out and cried, "If you don't go away, you drunken fellows, my mistress will send for the watch." "If you don't come down and open the door, we shall break it open," replied the officer sent to the duty. "Tell them it's no inn, Babette. We won't let people in after hours," cried the widow, turning in her bed, and anxious to resume her sound sleep. Babette gave the message and shut the window. "Break open the door," cried the officer to his attendants. In a minute or two the door was burst open, and the party ascended the staircase. "Mercy on me, Babette, if they aren't come in," cried the widow, who jumped out of her bed, and nearly shutting her door, which had been left open for ventilation, she peeped out to see who were the bold intruders. She perceived a man in black with a white staff. "What do you want?" screamed the widow, terrified. "We want Mistress Vandersloosh. Are you that person?" said the officer. "To be sure I am. But what do you want here?" "I must request you to dress and come along with me directly to the Stadthouse," replied the officer, very civilly. "Gott in Himmel! What's the matter?" "It's on a charge of treasonable practices, madam." "Oh, I see, Mr Vanslyperken. Very well, good sir, I'll put on my clothes directly. I'll get up any hour in the night with pleasure to bring that villain. Yes, yes, Mr Vanslyperken, we shall see. Babette, take the gentlemen down in the parlour, and give them some bottled beer. You'll find it very good, sirs. It's of my own brewing. And Babette, you must come up and help me." The officer did not think it necessary to undeceive the widow, who imagined that she was to give evidence against Vanslyperken, not that she was a prisoner herself. Still, the widow Vandersloosh did not like being called up at such an unseasonable hour, and thus expressed herself to Babette as she was dressing herself.
"Well, we shall see the ending of this, Babette. My under petticoat is on the chair. I told the lords the whole truth, every word of it, and I am convinced that they believe me, too. Don't pull tight all at once, Babette. How often do I tell you that? I do believe you missed a hole. The cunning villain goes there and says that yes, Babette, that I was a traitor myself, and I said to the lords, do I look like a traitor? My petticoats, Babette, how stupid you are. Why, your eyes are half shut now. You know I always wear the blue first, then the green, and the red last, and yet you will give me the first which comes. He's a handsome lord, that Duke of Portland. He was one of the bons before King William went over and conquered England, and he was made a lord for his valour. My rough Babette. The Dutch are a brave nation. My bustle now. How much beer did you give the officers? Mind you take care of everything while I am gone. I shall be home by 9, I dare say. I suppose they are going to try him now, that he may be hanged at sunrise. I knew how it would be. Yes, yes, Mr Vanslyperken, every dog has his day, and there's an end of you, and of your cur also, I've a notion." The widow being now duly equipped, walked downstairs to them, and proceeded with the officers to the Stadthouse. She was brought into the presence of Mynheer Engelback, who held the office of provost. "Here's the widow Vandersloosh, mynheer." "Very well," replied Engelback, who was in a very bad humour at the unsuccessful search after the conspirators. "Away with her." "Away! Where?" exclaimed the widow. Engelback did not condescend to make a reply. The officers were mute, but one stout man on either side seized her arms and led her away, notwithstanding expostulation and some resistance on her part. "Where am I going? What is all this?" exclaimed the widow, terrified, but there was no answer. At last they came to a door, held open already by another man with a bunch of keys. The terrified woman perceived that it was a paved stone cell, with a brick arch over it, in short, a dungeon. The truth flashed upon her for the first time. It was she who had been arrested for treason. But before she could shriek, she was shoved in, and the door closed and locked upon her, and the widow sank down into a sitting posture on the ground, overcome with astonishment and indignation. Was it possible? Had the villain prevailed? Was the question which she asked herself over and over again, changing alternately from sorrow to indignation, at one time wringing her hands, and at others exclaiming, "Well, well, Mr Vanslyperken, we shall see." End of chapter 48. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 49 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, in which is related much appertaining to the pomp and glorious circumstance of war. The arrival of Ramsay and his party was so unexpected that, at first, Lady Barclay imagined that they had been betrayed, and that the boat was filled with armed men from the king's cutter, who had come on shore with a view of forcing an entrance into the cave. In a minute every preparation was made for defence, for it had long been arranged that, in case of an unexpected attack, the women should make all the resistance in their power, and which the nature of the place enabled them to do. But, as many observed, the party, although coming from the cutter, and not badly armed, did not appear to advance in a hostile manner. After waiting some time near the boat, they advanced, each with a box on his shoulder, but what those boxes might be was a puzzle.
They might be hand grenades for throwing into the cave. However, they were soon down to the rock at which the ladder was let down, and then Smallbones stood up with a musket in his hands, with his straddling legs and short petticoat, and bawled out, "Who goes there?" Ramsay, who was assisting Wilhelmina, looked up, surprised at this singular addition to the occupants of the cave, and Wilhelmina also looked at him and said, "Can that be a woman, Ramsay?" "At all events, I've not the honour of her acquaintance, but she is pointing her musket." "We are friends," cried Ramsay. "Tell Mistress Alice it is Ramsay." Smallbones turned round and reported the answer, and then, in obedience to his orders from Mistress Alice, he cried out, in imitation of the sentinels, "Pass, Ramsay, and all's well," presented his arms, and made a flying leap off the rock where he stood, down on the platform, that he might lower the ladder as soon as Ramsay was up, who desired everybody might be sent down to secure the boxes of specie as fast as they could, lest the cutter's people, releasing themselves, should attempt an attack. Now there was no more concealment necessary, and the women as well as the men went down the precipitous path and brought up the treasure, while Ramsay introduced Wilhelmina to Lady Barclay, and in a brief but clear narrative told her all that had passed, and what they had now to expect. There was not a moment for delay. The cutter's people might send the despatches overland if they thought of it, and be there as soon, if not sooner, than themselves. Nancy Corbett was summoned immediately, and her instructions given. The whole of the confederates at Portsmouth were to come over to the cave, with what they could collect and carry about their persons, and, in case of the cutter sending overland, with the precaution of being in disguise. Of arms and ammunition there was sufficient in the cave, which Ramsay now felt was to be defended to the last, until they could make a retreat over to the other side of the channel. In half an hour Nancy was gone, and that very night had arrived at Portsmouth, and given notice to the whole of the confederates. Upon consultation it was considered that the best disguise would be that of females, and in consequence they were all so attired, and before morning had all passed over, 2 or 3 in a boat, and landed at Ryde, where they were collected by Moggy Salisbury, who alone of the party knew the way to the retreat. They walked across the island, 2 and 3, one party just keeping out of sight of the next ahead of them, and arrived without suspicion or interruption, conducted by Moggy Salisbury, Lazarus the Jew, and 16 stout and desperate men, who had remained secreted in the Jew's house, ready to obey any order, however desperate the risk might be, of their employers. When they were all assembled at the brow of the precipice, with the exception of Lazarus, who looked like a little old woman, a more gigantic race of females was never seen, for, determined upon a desperate resistance if discovered, they had their buff jerkins under their female garments. They were soon in the cave, and very busy, under Ramsay's directions, preparing against the expected attack. Sir Robert Barclay, with his boat, had been over 2 days before, and it was not known when he would return. That his presence was most anxiously looked for may be readily conceived, as his boat's crew would double their force if obliged to remain there, and his boat would enable them, with the one brought by Ramsay, to make their escape without leaving one behind before the attack could be made. Nancy Corbett, as the reader may have observed, did not return to the cave with the conspirators. As she was not suspected, she determined to remain at Portsmouth till the last, and watch the motions of the authorities. The cutter did not arrive till the evening of the 2nd day, and the despatches were not delivered to the admiral till the 3rd morning, when all was bustle and preparation. Nancy Corbett was everywhere. She found out what troops were ordered to embark on the expedition, and she was acquainted with some of the officers as well as the sergeants and corporals. An idea struck her which she thought she could turn to advantage. She slipped into the barrack yard, and to where the men were being selected, and was soon close to a sergeant whom she was acquainted with.
"So you've an expedition on hand, Sergeant Tanner?"
"Yes, Mistress Corbet, and I'm one of the party."
"I wish you joy," replied Nancy, sarcastically.
"Oh, it's nothing, Mistress Corbet, nothing at all, only some smugglers in a cave. We'll soon rout them out."
"I've heard a different account from the admiral's clerk."
"Why, what have you heard?"
"First tell me how many men are ordered out."
100 rank and file, 8 non-commissioned officers, 2 lieutenants, 1 captain, and 1 major.
"Bravo, Sergeant! You'll carry all before you."
"Why, I hope so, Mistress Corbet, especially as we are to have the assistance of the cutter's crew."
"Better and better still," replied Nancy, ironically. "I wish you joy of your laurel, Sergeant. Ha, ha, ha."
"Why do you laugh, Mistress Corbet? And what is it that you have heard at the admiral's office?"
"What you may hear yourself, and what I know to be true. There is not a single smuggler in the cave."
"No!" exclaimed the sergeant. "What, nobody there?"
"Yes, there is somebody there. The cave has been chosen by the smugglers to land their goods in."
"But some of them must be there in charge of the goods."
"Yes, so there are, but they are all women, the smugglers' wives who live there. What an expedition! Let me see. 1 gallant major, 1 gallant captain, 2 gallant lieutenants, 8 gallant non-commissioned officers, and 100 gallant soldiers of the Buffs, all going to attack and rout and defeat a score of old women."
"But you're joking, Mistress Nancy."
"Upon my life I'm not, Sergeant. You'll find it true. The admiral's ashamed of the whole affair, and the cutter's crew swear they won't fire a single shot."
"By the god of war!" exclaimed the sergeant. "But this is cursed bad news you bring, Mistress Corbet."
"Not at all. Your regiment will become quite the fancy. You'll go by the name of the Lady Killers. Ha, ha, ha! I wish you joy, Sergeant. Ha, ha, ha!"
Nancy Corbet knew well the power of ridicule. She left the sergeant, and was accosted by one of the lieutenants. She rallied him in the same way. "But are you really in earnest, Nancy?" said Lieutenant Dillon at last.
"Upon my soul I am. But at the same time I hear that they will fight hard, for they are well armed and desperate, like their husbands. And they swear that they'll all die to a woman before they yield. So now we shall see who fights best, the women or the men. I'll back my own sex for a gold Jacobus, lieutenant. Will you take the bet?"
"Good God, how very annoying! I can't. I won't order the men to fire at women. I could not do so if they were devils incarnate. A woman is a woman still."
"And never the worse for being brave, Lieutenant Dillon. As I said to Sergeant Tanner, your regiment after this will always go by the name of the Lady Killers."
"Damn!" exclaimed the lieutenant. "But now I recollect there must be more there. Those who had possession of the cutter, and who landed in her boat."
"Yes, with 40 boxes of gold, they say. But do you think they would be such fools as to remain there, and allow you to take their money? That boat started for France yesterday night with all the treasure, and is now safe at Cherbourg. I know it for a fact, for one of the men's wives who lives here showed me a letter to that effect from her husband, in which he requests her to follow him. But I must go now. Good bye, Mr. Lady Killer."
The lieutenant repeated what Nancy had told him to the officers, and the major was so much annoyed that he went up to the admiral, and stated what the report was, and that there were only women to contend with. "It is mentioned in the despatches, I believe," observed the admiral, that there are only women supposed to be in the cave, but the smugglers who are on board the cutter have left with the species yesternight, Admiral, so that we shall gain neither honour nor profit." "At all events, you will have the merit of obeying your orders, Major Lincoln." The Major made no reply, but went away very much dissatisfied. In the meantime, the sergeant had communicated with his non-commissioned officers and the privates ordered on duty, and the discontent was universal. Most of the men swore that they would not pull a trigger against women if they were shot for it. If they were shot for it, and the disaffection almost amounted to mutiny. Nancy, in the meantime, had not been idle. She had found means to speak with the boat's crew of the Jungfrau, stated the departure of the smugglers with their gold, and the fact that they were to fight with nothing but women, that the soldiers had vowed that they would not fire a shot, and that Moggy Salisbury, who was with them, swore that she would hoist up her smock as a flag, and fight to the last. This was soon known on board of the Jungfrau, and gave great disgust to every one of the crew, who declared to a man that they would not act against petticoats, much less fire a shot at Moggy Salisbury. What a mountain of mischief can be heaped up by the insidious tongue of one woman! After this explanation, it may be supposed that the zeal of the party despatched was not very great. The fact is, they were all sulky, from the major downwards among the military, and from Vanslyperken downwards among the naval portion of the detachment. Nancy Corbett, satisfied with having effected her object, had crossed over the night before and joined her companions in the cave, and what was extremely fortunate, on the same night Sir Robert Barclay came over in the lugger, and finding how matters stood, immediately hoisted both the boats up on the rocks, and taking up all the men, prepared with his followers for a vigorous resistance, naturally to be expected from those whose lives depended upon the issue of the conflict. The next morning the cutter was seen coming down with the boats in tow, hardly stemming the flood, from the lightness of the breeze, when Nancy Corbett requested to speak with Sir Robert Barclay. She stated to him what she had done, and the dissatisfaction among the troops and seamen in consequence, and submitted to him the propriety of all the smugglers being dressed as women, as it would operate more in their favour than if they had 50 more men to defend the cave. Sir Robert perceived the good sense of this suggestion, and consulted with Ramsay, who strongly urged the suggestion being acted upon. The men were summoned, and the affair explained to them, and the consequence was, that there was a scene of mirth and laughter, which ended with every man being fitted with women's attire. The only one who remained in the dress of a man was a woman, Wilhelmina Krause, but she was to remain in the cave with the other women, and take no part in the coming fray. End of chapter 49. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 50 of Snarleyyow by Frederick Marryatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In which the officers, non-commissioned officers, and rank and file are all sent to the right about. About noon the Jungfrau hove to off the cave, and the troops were told off into the boats. About 12:30 the troops were in the boats already. About 1 Mr Vanslyperken had hoisted out his own boats, and they were manned. Mr Vanslyperken, with his pistols in his belt and his sword drawn, told Major Lincoln that he was all ready. Major Lincoln, with his spy-glass in his hand, stepped into the boat with Mr Vanslyperken, and the whole detachment pulled for the shore, and landed in the small cove, where they found the smugglers' boats hoisted up on the rocks, at which the men appeared to be rejoiced, as they took it for granted that they would find some men to fight with instead of women. The major headed his men, and they commenced a scramble up the rocks, and arrived at the foot of the high rock which formed the platform above at the mouth of the cave, when the major cried "Halt!" A very judicious order, considering that it was impossible to go any farther. The soldiers looked about everywhere, but could find no cave, and after an hour's strict search, Major Lincoln and his officers, glad to be rid of the affair, held a consultation, and it was agreed that the troops should be re-embarked. The men were marched down again, very hot from their exertions, and thus the expedition would have ended without bloodshed, had it not been for the incautious behaviour of a woman. That woman was Moggy Salisbury, who, having observed that the troops were re-embarking, took the opportunity, while Sir Robert and all the men were keeping close, to hoist up a certain undergarment to a pole, as if in derision, thus betraying the locality of the cave, and running the risk of sacrificing the whole party in it. This, as it was going up, caught the eye of one of the seamen in the boat, who cried out, "There goes the ensign up to the peak at last." "Where?" exclaimed the major, pulling out his telescope. "Yes, by heavens, there it is, and there then must be the cave." Neither Sir Robert nor any of the conspirators were aware of this manoeuvre of Moggy's, for Smallbones, perceiving what she had done, hauled it down again in a minute afterwards, but it had been hoisted, and the major considered it his duty to return, so once more the troop ascended the precipitous path. Moggy then went into the cave. "They have found us out, sir," said she. "They point to us, and are coming up again. I will stand as sentry. The men won't fire at me, and if they do, I don't care." Sir Robert and Ramsay were in close consultation. It appeared to them that by a bold manoeuvre they would be able to get out of their scrape. The wind had gone down altogether, the sea was as smooth as glass, and there was every appearance of a continued calm. "If we could manage it, and I think we may, then the sooner the affair is brought to an issue the better." Moggy had now taken a musket on her shoulder, and was pacing up and down the edge of the flat in imitation of a sentry. She was soon pointed out, and a titter ran through the whole line. At last, as the major approached, she called out, "I say, soger, what are you doing here? Keep off, or I'll put a bullet in your jacket." "My good woman," replied the major, while his men laughed, "we do not want to hurt you, but you must surrender." "Surrender!" cried Moggy. "Who talks of surrendering? Hoist the colours there." Up went the chemise to the end of the pole, and Smallbones grinned as he hoisted it. "My good woman, we must obey our orders." "And I must obey mine," retorted Moggy. "Turn out the guard there." All the women now made their appearance, as had been arranged, with muskets on their shoulders, headed by little Lily, with her drawn sword. The sight of the child commanding the detachment was hailed with loud cheers and laughter. "That will do, that will do," cried Sir Robert, fearful for Lily. "Let them come in again." "They'll not fire first, at all events," cried Moggy. "Never fear, sir. Guard, turn in," continued she, upon which Lily and her squadron then disappeared. "Upon my honour, this is too ridiculous," said Lieutenant Dillon. "Upon my soul, I don't know what is to be done," rejoined the major. "Moggy, we must commence hostilities somehow or another," cried Sir Robert from within. Smallbones here came out with his musket to release Moggy, and Moggy retired into the cave. The major, who imagined that there must be a path to the cave on the other side, now advanced with the determination of finding it out, and somehow or another putting an end to this unusual warfare. "If you please, you'll keep back, or I'll fire," cried Smallbones, levelling his musket. The major went on, heedless of the threat. Smallbones discharged his piece, and the major fell.
"Confound that she-devil! Are you hurt, Major?" cried Lieutenant Dillon.
"Yes, I am. I can't move." Another shot was now fired, and the sergeant fell.
"Hell and flames! What must we do?"
But now the whole party of smugglers poured out of the cave as women with bonnets on, and commenced a murderous fire upon the troops, who fell in all directions. The captain, who had assumed the command, now attempted to find his way to the other side of the cave, where he had no doubt he should find the entrance, but in so doing the soldiers were exposed to a most galling fire, without being able to return it. At first the troops refused to fire again, for that they had to deal with the smugglers' wives they made certain of. Even in the thickest of the smoke there was nothing masculine to be seen, and those troops who were at a greater distance and could return the fire did not. They were rather amused at the character of the women, and not being aware that their comrades were falling so fast, remained inactive. But there is a limit to even gallantry, and as the wounded men were carried past them, their indignation was roused, and at last the fire was as warmly returned, but before that took place one half of the detachment was hors de combat. All the assistance which they might have received from the covering party of sailors on the beach was neutralized. They did not know how much the soldiers had suffered, and although they fired in pursuance of orders, they would not take any aim. For some time the soldiers were forced on to the eastern side of the rock, which, as the reader may recollect, was much more precipitous than the western side, where it was descended from by the latter. Here they were at the mercy of the conspirators, who, concealed below the masses of the rock on the platform, took unerring aim. The captain had fallen, Lieutenant Dillon was badly wounded and led back to the boats, and the command had devolved upon a young man who had but just joined the regiment, and who was ignorant of anything like military tactics, even if they could have been brought into play upon the service. "Do you call this fighting with women, Sergeant Tanner?" said one of the men. "I've seen service, but such a murderous fire I was never in. Why, we've lost 2/3 of our men." "And we shall lose them all before we find out the mouth of this cursed cave. The regiment has lost its character for ever, and I don't care how soon a bullet settles my business." Ramsay now detached a party of the men to fire at the covering party of seamen who were standing by the boats in the cove, and who were unprotected, while his men were concealed behind the masses of rocks. Many fell, wounded or killed, and Vanslyperken, after shifting about from one position to another, ordered the wounded men to be put into his boat, and with 2 hands he pulled off, as he said, to procure more ammunition, leaving the remainder of his detachment on shore to do as well as they could. "I thought as how this work would be too warm for him," observed Bill Spurey. "Yes," replied Short, who at the moment received a bullet in his thigh and fell down among the rocks. The fire upon the seamen continued to be effective. Move from their post they did not, but one after another they sank wounded on the ground. The soldiers were now without any one to command them, for those who had forced their way to the western side of the rock, finding that advance or retreat was alike impossible, crawled under the sides of the precipice to retreat from a murderous fire which they could not return. The others were scattered here and there, protecting themselves as well as they could below the masses of stone, and returning the fire of the conspirators surely and desperately. But of the 100 men sent upon the expedition, there were not 20 who were not killed or wounded, and nearly the whole detachment of seamen had fallen where they stood. It was then 4 o'clock. The few men who remained unhurt were suffering from the extreme heat and exertion, and devoured with thirst. The wounded cried for water. The sea was still, calm, and smooth as a mirror. Not a breath of wind blew to cool the fevered brows of the wounded men, and the cutter, with her sails hanging listless, floated about on the glassy water about 1/4 mile from the beach. "Now is our time, Sir Robert." "Yes, Ramsay, now for one bold dash. Off with this woman's gear, my men. Buckle on your swords, and put pistols in your belts." In a very short time this order was complied with, and, notwithstanding some of the men were wounded in this day's affair, as well as in the struggle for the deck of the cutter, the 3 bands from Amsterdam, Portsmouth, and Cherbourg mustered 40 resolute and powerful men. The ladder was lowered down, and they descended. Sir Robert ordered Jemmy Ducks and Smallbones to remain and haul up the ladder again, and the whole body hastened down to the cove, headed by Sir Robert and Ramsay, seized the boats, and shoved off for the cutter. End of Chapter 50. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 51 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In which the Jacobite cause is triumphant by sea as well as by land. The great difficulty which Sir Robert Barclay had to surmount was, to find the means of transport over the Channel for their numerous friends, male and female, then collected in the cave. Now that their retreat was known, it was certain that some effective measure would be taken by government, by which, if not otherwise reduced, they would be surrounded and starved into submission. The 2 boats which they had were not sufficient for the transport of so numerous a body, consisting now of nearly 150 individuals, and their means of subsistence were limited to a few days. The arrival of the cutter with the detachments was no source of regret to Sir Robert, who hoped, by the defeat of the troops, to obtain their boats, and thus make his escape. But this would have been difficult, if not impossible, if the cutter had been under command, as she carried 4 guns, and could have prevented their escape, even if she did not destroy the boats. But when Sir Robert observed that it had fallen calm, it at once struck him that if, after defeating the troops, they could board and carry the cutter, all their difficulties were over. Then they could embark the whole of their people, and run her over to Cherbourg. This was the plan proposed by Sir Robert, and agreed to by Ramsay, and to accomplish this, now that the troops were put to the rout, they had made a rush for and obtained the boats. As for the women left in the cave, they were perfectly secure for the time, as, without scaling ladders, there was no possibility of the remaining troops, even if they were rallied, being able to effect anything. That part of the crew of the Yungfrau who had perceived them rush down to the beach reported it to Mr Vanslyperken, who had gone down to his cabin, not choosing to take any further part in the affray, or to risk his valuable life. Vanslyperken came on deck, where he witnessed the manning of the boats and their pushing out of the cove. "They are coming to attack us, sir," said Coble, who had been left in charge of the cutter when Mr Vanslyperken went on shore. Mr Vanslyperken turned pale as a sheet. His eyes were fixed upon the form of Ramsay, standing up on the stern sheets of the first boat, with his sabre raised in the air. He immediately recognised him, panted for breath, and could make no reply. The crew of the cutter, weakened as they were by the loss of most of their best men, flew to their arms. Coble, Cornelius, and Jansen, and Corporal Van Spitter were to be seen in the advance, encouraging them.
"God for Dam, let us have one slap for it," cried Jansen.
"Mein Gott, yes," shouted the corporal.
Vanslyperken started up. "It's no use, my men. It's madness, useless, sacrifice of life. They are 2 to 1. We must surrender. Go down below, all of you. Do you hear? Obey my orders."
"Yes, and report them too to the admiral," replied Coble, I never heard such an order given in my born days, and 50 odd years I have served in the king's fleet." "Corporal Van Spitter, I order you below. All of you below," cried Vanslyperken. "I command here. Will you obey, sir?" "Mein Gott, yes," replied the corporal, walking away and coolly descending the ladder. The boats were now within 10 yards of the cutter, and the men stood irresolute. The corporal obeying orders had disheartened them, and some of them followed the corporal. "It's no use," said Coble. "I sees now it's of no use. It's only being cut to pieces for nothing, my men. But I won't leave the deck." Coble threw away his cutlass and walked aft. The other men did the same, all but Jansen, who still hesitated. Coble caught the cutlass out of his hand and threw it overboard, just as the boats dashed alongside. "Gott verdam!" muttered Jansen, folding his arms and facing the men who jumped on the cutter's deck. Ramsay, who was first on board, when he perceived that the men were standing on the decks without making any opposition, turned and threw up the points of the swords of some of his men who were rushing blindly on, and in a minute all was quiet on the decks of the Yungfrau. Mr Vanslyperken was not to be seen. At the near approach of the boats he had hastened into his cabin and locked himself in, his only feeling being that Ramsay's wrath must cool, and his life be spared. "My lads," said Sir Robert to the crew of the cutter, "I am very glad that you made no resistance to a force which you could not resist, as I should have been sorry if one of you had lost his life. But you must now go down below and leave the cutter's deck in our possession. Perhaps it would be better if some of you took one of your boats and went on shore to pick up your messmates who are wounded." "If you please, sir, we will," said Coble, coming forward, "and the cutter is yours as far as we are concerned. We will make no attempts to retake her, at all events, for your kindness in thinking of our poor fellows lying there on the beach. I think you will promise that, my lads," continued Coble, turning to the men. "Yes, we promise that," said the men. Coble then took the crew with him and pulled on shore to the cove, on the margin of which they found all their men lying either killed or wounded. Dick Short, Spurey, and 9 others were taken up on board. Those that were quite dead were left upon the sand. Leaving only 10 men on board the cutter, which, however, was sufficient to cope with the few of the Yungfrau remaining on board, had they been inclined to forfeit their word, Sir Robert and Ramsay then returned with the rest of the party to the boats and pulled on shore, for the rest of their assailants were not subdued. About 20 of the soldiers still remained unhurt, and were sitting down on the rocks. Ramsay, as soon as he landed, showed a white handkerchief on a bayonet fixed to the muzzle of a musket. "Sergeant Tanner," said one of the men, "there's a flag of truce." "Is there? I'm not sorry for it. They are 2 to 1 even now. I'll go forward to meet it." The sergeant advanced to meet Ramsay. "We might, if we pleased, oblige you to surrender or cut you to pieces, that you must own, but we have no wish to hurt you. There are too many good men dead already." "That's true," replied the sergeant, "but it's one comfort you have turned out at last to be men and not women." "We have, but to the terms. You were sent to take possession of the cave. You shall have possession as soon as we are gone, if you will draw off your party higher up this cliff, and allow us to embark without molestation. If you do not immediately accept these terms, we shall certainly attack you. Or you may do better if you please. Pile your muskets, collect your wounded men, bring them down to the beach all ready to put into the boats, which, as soon as we are safe, we will give you possession of. Now, is it a truce or not? You must be immediate." "Yes, then, it is a truce, for I see no chance of better terms. I am commanding officer, and you have the faith of Sergeant Tanner." The sergeant then returned, and when half way called to his men. Party, fall in. Pile arms." The soldiers, worn out by the long conflict, and aware that they had no chance against such superior numbers, gladly obeyed, and were now divided in sections of 3 and 4, collecting the wounded and carrying them down to the cove. Sir Robert and his men hastened to the rock, the ladder was lowered, and all was on the alert for embarkation. Lady Barclay and Lily flew into his arms, while Wilhelmina hung on Ramsay. But they allowed but a short time for endearment. Time was too precious. The luggage had all been prepared, and the chests of specie were lowered, the bundles thrown down, and in a quarter of an hour the cave was cleared of all that they could take away with them. The women then descended, and all hands were employed carrying away the specie and luggage down to the boats. As soon as one boat was loaded with the boxes of money, Lady Ramsay, Lily, and Wilhelmina were put into it, and one half of the men went with them on board of the cutter, where Coble had already arrived with the wounded seamen. Ramsay remained with the other boat to embark the women and luggage. When all was in, he called the sergeant, pointed out to him the ladder, and told him that he might find something worth his trouble in the cave. "Is there a drop of anything to drink, sir? For we who are whole are dying with thirst, and it's cruel to hear the poor wounded fellows beg for water." "You will find both water and spirits in plenty there, sergeant, and you may tell your own story when you arrive at Portsmouth. We shall never contradict you." "The list of killed, wounded, and missing will tell the story fast enough," replied the sergeant. "But run up there, my lads, and get some water for these poor fellows. Good bye, sir, and many thanks." "Good bye to you, Sergeant Tanner," said one of the women in the boat. "Nancy Corbett, by all that's wonderful!" cried the sergeant. "I told you so, sergeant. You'll never lose the name of lady killer." "Pretty lady killing," muttered the sergeant, turning away in a rage. Ramsay took the boats on board, and as soon as they were cleared, they were towed on shore to the cove by some of the Yungfrau's men. During this time the ladies, as well as the women, had remained aft on deck, Vanslyperken having locked himself up in his cabin. But Sir Robert now ordered his men to force the cabin door, and take Mr Vanslyperken forward on the lower deck. When the door was opened, Vanslyperken was found in his bed, more dead than alive. He was pulled out and dragged forward. The ladies were then handed below, and as soon as the specie had been put down, and the luggage cleared from the upper deck, the women were ordered to go down on the lower deck, and Mr Vanslyperken ordered to be brought up. End of chapter 51. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 52 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In which a great deal of loyalty is shown to counterbalance the treason of Vanslyperken. We must not, however, forget the syndic and the widow Vandersloosh, whom we left in confinement in Amsterdam. We left Mynheer Krause smoking his pipe, and showing to those about him how great a great man always proves himself when under adversity. The widow also, had she performed in public, would have been acknowledged to have been a great woman. She could not but lament the present, for she was on the floor of a dungeon, so she occasionally wrung her hands, but she looked forward to the future, and to better times, not abandoning herself to despair, but comforting herself with hope, as might have been clearly proved by her constant repetition of these words: "Well, well, Mr Vanslyperken, we shall see." That the night appeared long to both parties is not to be denied, but the longest night will have its end, so long as the world continues to turn round. The consequence was that the morning came as usual to the syndic, although the widow, from the peculiarity of her situation, had not the same advantage. After morning comes breakfast, in the natural order of mundane affairs, and kings being but men, and subject to the same wants as other mortals, his Majesty King William sat down and despatched a very hasty meal, in company with his Grace the Duke of Portland, and the Right Honourable the Lord Albemarle. History does not record, as it sometimes does in works of this description, by what viands his Majesty's appetite was stimulated. We must therefore pass it over, and, as his Majesty did on that occasion, as soon as breakfast was over, proceed to business. "Have you received information, my Lord Albemarle, how many of the conspirators have been seized?" "May it please your Majesty, I am sorry to inform you that all who were innocent have been imprisoned, and all who were guilty have escaped." Upon this intelligence his Majesty looked very grave. "How do you mean, my lord?" said he, after a pause. "The conspirators have all received some friendly notice, and the only two who are in custody are the syndic, Mynheer Krause, and the woman who keeps the Lust House." "And you put the syndic down as an innocent person, my lord?" "If your Majesty will be pleased to read this communication," replied Lord Albemarle, presenting Ramsay's letter and enclosures, "you will then be of my opinion." King William took the letter and read it. "What Ramsay? He who was attainted with Sir Robert Barclay?" "The same, your Majesty." "So near us, and escaped! But what credence would you place in him?" "Every credence, may it please your Majesty. I believe him to be incapable of a lie." "A traitor like him?" "A traitor to your Majesty, but most true to his Catholic Majesty King James that was. But if I venture to point out to your Majesty, the enclosures prove that Lieutenant Vanslyperken's word is not of much value. He at least is a double traitor." "Yes, a little hanging will do him no harm. You are sure this is his writing?" "There can be no doubt of it, your Majesty. I have compared it." "You will see to this, my lord. And now to the syndic." "He has, as your Majesty will perceive, been grossly deceived, and suspected without reason." "And the woman?" "Was here yesterday, and fully convinced me that Vanslyperken was a traitor, and that she was innocent. His Grace of Portland was present." "Well, my lord, you may give orders for their release. Of course, a little surveillance will be advisable. You will justify the proceedings to the council this afternoon." "But may I presume to submit to your Majesty that the public affront offered to the syndic should be repaired?" "Certainly, send for him," replied his Majesty carelessly. "I will receive him to morrow morning." And his Majesty left the room. Lord Albemarle immediately despatched a courier with an order for the release of the syndic and the Frau Vandersloosh, with a note to the former stating that his Majesty would receive him on the following day at noon. But while this act of justice had been preparing at the Palace of the Hague, there were other acts, not quite so justifiable, performing at the town of Amsterdam. The Sun made its appearance more than an hour before the troops of the Royal Guard. Mobs were collected in knots in the street, and in front of the Hotel de Ville, or Stadthouse, and the object of their meeting was to canvass the treason and imprisonment of the syndic, Mynheer Van Krause. "Shame! Shame! Death to the traitor! Tear him to pieces!" and "Long life to King William!" were the first solitary remarks made. The noise and hubbub increased. The small knots of people gradually joined together, until they formed a large mob, all burning with loyalty, and each individual wishing to give a practical evidence of it. Again were the cries of "Long live the king!" and "Death to the traitors!" to be heard, with loud huzzas. A confused din followed, and the mob appeared, as if simultaneously, to be all impelled in one direction. At last the word was given, which they all waited for. "To his house! To his house! Down with it! Death to the traitor!" And the loyal mob hastened on, each individual eager to be the first to prove his loyalty by helping himself to Mynheer Krause's goods and chattels. In the Low Countries this species of loyalty always has been and is now very much the fashion. In 10 minutes the gates were forced open, old Coops knocked down and trod under foot till he was dead. Every article of value that was portable was secured. Chairs, tables, glasses, not portable, were thrown out of the window. Wilhelmina's harp and pianoforte battered into fragments. Beds, bedding, everywhere flew about in the air, and then the fragments of the furniture were set fire to, and in less than an hour Mynheer Krause's splendid house was burning furiously, while the mob cheered and cried, "Long live King William!" Before the courier could arrive from the Hague, all that was left of Mr. Krause's property was the bare walls. Merchandises, everything was consumed, and part of the building had fallen into the canal and choked it up, while 15 schuyts waiting to be discharged of their cargoes had been obliged to retreat from the fury of the flames, the phlegmatic skippers looking on with their pipes in their mouths and their hands in their wide breeches pockets. The loyal mob, having effected their object, gradually retired. It is singular that popular feeling is always expressed in the same way. Had the mob collected for disloyal purposes, they would have shown their disloyalty just in the like manner, only it would have been the Stadthouse instead of that of Mynheer Krause. But now there was a fresh impetus given to the feelings of the mob. The news had been spread like wildfire, that Mynheer the Syndic had been proved innocent, and ordered to be immediately liberated, and was sent for by his Majesty, upon which the mob were undecided whether they should prove their indignation at this unjust imprisonment of their worthy magistrate by setting fire to some public building, or by carrying him in triumph to his own house, which they forgot they had burnt down. Fortunately they decided upon the latter. They surrounded the Stadthouse with cries of "Long life to our worthy syndic! Prosperity to Mynheer Krause!" and rushing upstairs they caught him in their arms and carried him triumphantly through the streets, bringing him at last to the smoking ruins of his own house, and there they left him. They had done all they could. They had carried him there in triumph, but as for building the house up again, that was impossible. So as Mynheer Krause looked with dismay at the wreck of all his property, the loyal mob dispersed, each feeling that he had been a little too hasty in possessing himself of a small share of it. What a fine thing is loyalty! Mynheer Krause found himself alone. He looked with scorn and indignation upon the scene of violence, and then walked away to an hotel, particularly disgusted with the loyal cry of "Long live King William!" In the meantime the door of the dungeon where the widow Vandersloosh was incarcerated was thrown open, and she was informed that she was no longer a prisoner. The widow, indignant that she should have been confined for her loyalty, raved and walked majestically out of the Stadthouse, not deigning to answer to the compliments offered to her by some of the inferior officers. Her bosom swelled with indignation, and she was determined to tell his Majesty a bit of her mind, if she should obtain access to him, and the next day she took the trouble to go all the way to the Hague again to see his Majesty. But his Majesty wasn't at home, and Lord Albemarle, to whom she sent in, was indisposed, and his Grace the Duke of Portland was particularly engaged, so the widow had the journey for nothing, and she declared to Babette that she never would put her foot under the palace roof again as long as she lived. But although Madame Vandersloosh was not received at court that day, the syndic Mynheer Krause was. When he sent in his name, Lord Albemarle led the syndic by the hand to his Majesty. "We have been too hasty, Mynheer Krause," said his Majesty, with a gracious smile. Mynheer bowed low. "I regret to hear that the populace, in their loyalty, have burnt down your house, Mr. Krause. They were too hasty." Mynheer Krause made another low bow. "You will continue your office of syndic of the town of Amsterdam." "Pardon me, your Majesty," replied Mynheer Krause respectfully, but firmly. "I have obeyed your summons to appear in your presence, but will request that your Majesty will release me from the burden. I have come to lay my chain and staff of office at your Majesty's feet, it being my intention to quit the town." "You are too hasty, Mynheer Krause," replied his Majesty, with displeasure. "May it please your Majesty," replied Krause, "he who has been confined as a prisoner in the Stadthouse is not fit to exercise his duties there as a judge. I have served your Majesty many years with the utmost zeal and fidelity. In return, I have been imprisoned, and my property destroyed. I must now return to a station more suitable to my present condition, and once more, with every assurance of loyalty, I beg to be permitted to lay my insignia of office at your Majesty's feet." Mynheer Krause suited the action to the word. The king frowned and turned away to the window, and Mynheer Krause, perceiving that his Majesty's back was turned upon him, walked out of the door. "Too hasty," thought Mynheer Krause. "I am loyal, and thrown into prison, and am expected to be satisfied with the plea of being too hasty. My house is burnt down, and the plundering mob have been too hasty. Well, well, it is fortunate I took Ramsay's advice. My house and what was in it was a trifle, but if all my gold at Hamburg and Frankfurt, and in the charge of Ramsay, had been there, and I had been made a beggar, all the satisfaction I should have received would have been a smile and the excuse of being too hasty. I wonder where my daughter and Ramsay are. I long to join them." From which mental soliloquy it will be evident to the reader that Mynheer Krause's loyalty had been considerably diminished, perhaps thinking that he had paid too dear for the commodity. Upon his return, Mynheer Krause publicly announced that he had resigned the office of syndic, much to the astonishment of those who heard of it, and much to the delight of his very particular friend Engelback, who the next morning set off for the Hague, and had an interview with his Grace the Duke of Portland, the result of which was, that upon grounds best known to the parties, for history will not reveal everything, Mynheer Engelback was recommended to fill the office of syndic of the town of Amsterdam, vacant by the resignation of Mynheer Krause, and that in consequence of this, all those who took off their hats to Mynheer Krause but 2 days before, and kept them on when they met Mynheer Engelback, now kept them on when they met Mynheer Krause, and pulled them off very politely to Mynheer Krause's very particular friend, Mynheer Engelback. End of chapter 52. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 53 of Snarleyyow by Frederick Marryatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Trial and execution of two of the principal personages in our history. We left Sir Robert Barclay on the deck of the cutter, the ladies and women sent down below, and Mr Vanslyperken on the point of being dragged aft by two of Sir Robert's men. The crew of the Yungfrau at the time were on the lower deck, some assisting the wounded men, others talking with Jemmy Salisbury and his wife, whom they were astonished to find among the assailants. Why, Jemmy, how did you get a berth among those chaps?" "I'll tell you," said Moggy, interrupting. "When he was last at Portsmouth, they heard him playing his fiddle and singing, and they took such a fancy to him that they were determined to have him to amuse them in the cave. So one evening they kidnapped him, took him away by main force, and kept him a prisoner ever since." "That's carrying the joke rather too far," observed one of the men. "Mein Gott, yes," replied the corporal. "But I am at liberty again now, at all events," replied Jemmy, taking the cue from his wife, "and if that chap Vanslyperken don't command the cutter any more, which I've a notion he will not, I shall enter as boatswain, eh, Dick?" "Yes," replied Short, who was swinging in his hammock. "Well, when I found that Jemmy couldn't be found, that my dear darling duck of a husband, my jewel, a box of diamonds, aren't you, my Jemmy? Didn't I tear my hair and run about the streets like a mad woman?" continued Moggy. "At last I met with Nancy Corbett, whose husband is one of the gang, and she told me where he was, fiddle and all, and I persuaded her to let me go to him, and that's why we both are here." This was a good intention of Moggy's, and as there was nobody who took the trouble to disprove it, it was received as not the least apocryphal. But now Mr Vanslyperken was dragged past them by two of the conspirators, and all the men of the Yungfrau followed on deck to see what was to take place. When Mr Vanslyperken had been brought aft, his legs tottered, and he could hardly stand. His face was livid, and his lips white with fear, and he knew too well that he had little mercy to expect. "Now, sir," said Sir Robert, with a stern air, "hear the accusation against you, for although we may be lawless, we will still be just. You voluntarily entered into our service and received our pay. You are one of us, with only this difference, that we have taken up the cause from principle and loyalty, and you joined us from mercenary motives. Still we kept our faith with you. For every service performed, you are well and honourably paid. But you received our money and turned against us, revealed our secrets, and gave information to your government, by which that gentleman," pointing to Ramsay, "and many others, had not they fortunately received timely notice, would have perished by the gibbet. Now, sir, I wish to know what you can bring forward in your defence. What have you to urge that you should not die the death which you so traitorously prepared for others?" "Die!" exclaimed Vanslyperken. "No, no, mercy, sir, mercy. I am not fit to die." "Few are, but this is certain, that a villain like you is not fit to live." "On my knees I ask mercy," cried the frightened wretch, dropping down. "Mr Ramsay, speak for me." "I will speak," replied Ramsay, "but not for you. I will show you that even if you were to escape us, you would still be hung, for all your extracts of the despatches I have, with full explanation, put into the hands of the English government. Do you expect mercy from them? They have not shown much as yet." "O God! O God!" exclaimed Vanslyperken, throwing himself down on the deck in despair. "Now, my lads, you have heard the charges against this man, and also that he has no defence to offer. What is your sentence?" "Death!" exclaimed the conspirators. "You men belonging to the cutter, you have heard that this man has betrayed the present government of England, in whose pay and service he was at the time. What is your opinion?" Hereupon Obadiah Coble hitched up his trousers, and said, "Why, as a matter of opinion, I agrees with you, sir, whomsoever you may be." "Mein Gott, yes, sir," exclaimed the corporal. And all the crew cried out together, "Death! Death!" which, by the bye, was very mutinous. You perceive that you are doubly condemned as a double traitor, said Sir Robert. So prepare to die. The religion you profess I know not, but the time you will be allowed to make your peace with your God is 15 minutes.
Oh!
groaned Vanslyperken, with his face to the deck. Up there, my lads, and get a whip on the yard arm, said Ramsay. Some of the party went to obey the order, and they were assisted by the seamen of the Yungfrau. But while they were getting the whip ready on the starboard, Jemmy Ducks was very quietly employed getting another on the larboard yard arm, which nobody took notice of. As soon as the whip and the cord with the hangman's noose made fast to it were all ready, it was reported to Sir Robert by Corporal Van Spitter, who stepped up to him with his usual military salute. Sir Robert took off his hat in return. His watch had been held in his hand from the time that he had passed sentence upon Vanslyperken, who still remained prostrate on the deck. It is my duty to inform you, sir, that but 5 minutes are left of the time awarded to you, said Sir Robert to Vanslyperken.
5 minutes! exclaimed Vanslyperken, jumping up from the deck. But 5 minutes! To die in 5 minutes! continued he, looking up with horror at the rope at the yard arm, and the fatal noose at the end of it, held in the hand of Corporal Van Spitter. Stop! I have gold, plenty of gold. I can purchase my life.
Kingdoms would not purchase it, said Sir Robert scornfully.
Oh!
exclaimed Vanslyperken, wringing his hands.
Must I leave all my gold?
You have but 2 minutes, sir, observed Sir Robert. Let the rope be put round his neck. This office was performed by Corporal Van Spitter. The corporal was quite an amateur.
Mercy! Mercy!
cried Vanslyperken, again falling on his knees and holding up his hands. Call upon heaven for mercy. You have but 1 minute left. But here an interruption took place. A female made her appearance on the other side of the deck, dragging by a cord the hero of our novel, Snarleyyow, who held back with all his power, jerking his head to the right and to the left, but it was of no use. He was dragged opposite to where Vanslyperken knelt. As the reader may guess, this person was Smallbones, who had tied on a bonnet and muffled up his face so as not to be observed when he first went on board. Jemmy Ducks now assisted, and the whip on the larboard yard arm was made fast to a cord with a running noose for the hanging of the cur. The sight roused Vanslyperken.
My dog! exclaimed he. Woman, leave that dog alone. Who are you that dare touch my dog?
The female turned round, threw off her bonnet and handkerchief, and exhibited to the terrified lieutenant the face of the supposed departed Smallbones. Smallbones! exclaimed the crew of the Yungfrau in a breath.
God of mercy, help me! God of mercy!
cried Vanslyperken, aghast.
I suppose that you do come for to know me now, anyhow, said Smallbones.
Hath the sea given up its dead?
replied Vanslyperken in a hollow voice.
No, it aren't, 'cause why? I never was a drown, replied Smallbones. No thanks to you, though. But if so be as I supposes you are going to be hung, as I'm a good Christian, I'll forgive you, that is, if you'll be hung, you know.
Vanslyperken, who now perceived that Smallbones had been by some miracle preserved, recovered himself.
If you forgive me, replied Vanslyperken, then pray do not ill treat my dog.
I's not forgiven him, anyhow. I owes him enough, and now I'll have his account settled, by gum. When you goes up there, he goes up here, as sure as I'm Peter Smallbones.
Be merciful,
exclaimed Vanslyperken, who, strange to say, forgot his own miseries in pleading for his darling cur.
He be a convicted traitor, and he shall die, by gum,
cried Smallbones, smacking his fist into the palm of his hand. During the conversation, the time allotted to Vanslyperken had long expired, but the interest occasioned by it had inclined Sir Robert to wait till it was over. "Enough," cried Sir Robert, "your time is too long expired. Commend your soul to God. Let the rope be manned."
"Now, Jemmy, stand by to toddle forwards," cried Smallbones.
"One moment, I ask for but one moment," cried
Vanslyperken, much agitated.
"Only one moment, sir."
"For what?"
"To kiss my poor dog,"
replied Vanslyperken, bursting into tears. Strange and almost ridiculous as was the appeal, there was a seriousness and a pathos in Vanslyperken's words, and a manner which affected those who were present like a gleam of sunshine. This one feeling, which was unalloyed with baser metal, shone upon the close of a worthless and wicked life. Sir Robert nodded his head, and Vanslyperken walked with his rope round his neck over to where the dog was held by Smallbones, bent over the cur, and kissed it again and again. "Enough," cried Sir Robert, "bring him back." Corporal Van Spitter took hold of Vanslyperken by the arm, and dragged him to the other side of the deck. The unfortunate wretch was wholly absorbed in the fate of his cur, who had endeavoured to follow his master. His eyes were fixed upon Snarleyyow, and Snarleyyow's were fixed upon his master. Thus they were permitted to remain for a few seconds, when Sir Robert gave the signal. Away went the line of men who had manned the starboard whip, and away went Jemmy Ducks on the larboard side, and at the yard arms of the cutter were suspended the bodies of Vanslyperken and Snarleyyow. Thus perished one of the greatest scoundrels and one of the vilest curs which ever existed. They were damnable in their lives, and in their deaths they were not divided. By the manuscript records found in the Jacobite papers, it appears that the double execution took place on the 3rd of August, in the year of our Lord 1700. End of chapter 53. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 54 of Snarleyyow by Frederick Marryatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In which affairs begin to wind up. There are few people whose vindictive feelings are not satisfied with the death of the party against whom those feelings have been excited. The eyes of all on deck, that is, all except one, were at first directed to the struggling Vanslyperken, and then, as if sickened at the sight of his sufferings, were turned away with a feeling very near akin to compassion. One only looked or never thought of Vanslyperken, and that one was Smallbones, who watched the kicking and plunging of his natural enemy, Snarleyyow. Gradually the dog relaxed his exertions, and Smallbones watched, somewhat doubtful, whether a dog who had defied every other kind of death would condescend to be hanged. At last Snarleyyow was quite still. He appeared nearly to have gone to where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest.
"He won't come to life any more this time," said Smallbones, "but I'll not let you out of my hands yet. They say a cat have 9 lives, but, by gum, some dogs have 90.
There was a dead silence on the deck of the cutter for a quarter of an hour, during which the bodies remained suspended. A breeze then came sweeping along, and ruffled the surface of the water. This was of too great importance to allow of further delay. Sir Robert desired the seamen of the Yungfrau to come aft, told them he should take their cutter to Cherbourg to land the women and his own people, and that then they would be free to return to Portsmouth. All that he requested of them was to be quiet and submissive during the short time that he and his party were on board. Coble replied for the ship's company. As for the matter of that ere, there was no fear of their being quiet enough when there were more than 2 to 1 against them, but that in fact they had no animosity, for even if they did feel a little sore at what had happened, and their messmates being wounded, what was swinging at the yard arm made them all friends again. The gentleman might take the cutter where he pleased, and might use her as long as he liked, and when he had done with her, it was quite time enough to take her back to Portsmouth. "Well, then, as we understand one another, we had now better make sail," said Sir Robert. "Cut away that rope," continued he, pointing to the whip by which Vanslyperken's body was suspended. Jansen stepped forward with his snickersee, the rope was divided at once, and the body of the departed Vanslyperken plunged into the wave and disappeared. "They mayn't cut this, though," cried Smallbones. "I'll not trust him. Jemmy, my boy, get up a pig of ballast. I'll sink him 50 fathoms deep, and then if so be he come up again, why then I give it up for a bad job." Jemmy brought up the pig of ballast, the body of Snarleyyow was lowered on board, and after having been secured with divers turns of the rope to the piece of iron, was plunged by Smallbones into the wave. "There," said Smallbones, "I don't think that he will ever bite me any more anyhow. There's no knowing though. Now I'll just go down and see if my bag is to be found, and then I'll dress myself like a Christian." The cutter flew before the breeze, which was on her quarter, and now that the hanging was over, the females came on deck. One of the Jesuit priests was a good surgeon, and attended to the wounded men, who all promised to do well, and, as Bill Spurey said, "they'd all dance yet at the corporal's wedding." "I say, corporal, if we could only go to Amsterdam instead of going to Portsmouth." "Mein Gott, yes," replied the corporal, and, acting upon this idea, he went aft and entered into conversation with Ramsay, giving him a detail of the affair with the widow, and of her having gone to the Hague to accuse Vanslyperken, ending with expressing his wish of himself and the crew that they might go to the Hague instead of going to Portsmouth. Nothing could please Ramsay more. He was most anxious to send a letter to Mynheer Krause, to inform him of the safety of his daughter, and he immediately answered that they might go if they pleased. "Mein Gott, but how, mynheer? We no have the excuse." "But I'll give you one," replied Ramsay. "You shall go to the Hague." The corporal touched his hat with the greatest respect, and walked forward to communicate this good news. The crew of the Yungfrau and the conspirators or smugglers were soon on the best of terms, and as there was no one to check the wasteful expenditure of stores, and no one accountable, the liquor was hoisted up on the forecastle, and the night passed in carousing. "Well, he did love his dog after all," said Jemmy Ducks. "And he's got his love with him," replied one of the smugglers. "Now, Jemmy, let's have a song." "It must be without the fiddle then," replied Jemmy, "for that's jammed up with the baggage, so here goes. I've often heard the chaplain say, when Davy Jones is nigh, that we must call for help in need to Providence on high. But then he said most plainly too, that we must do our best, our own exertions failing, leave to Providence the rest. I never thought of this much till one day there came on board a chap who ventured to join as seaman by the Lord. His hair hung down like reef points, and his phiz was very queer, for his mouth was like a shark's, and turned down from ear to ear. He hadn't stowed his hammock not much longer than a week, when he swore he had a call, and the Lord he was to seek. Now where he went to seek the Lord I can't at all suppose. 'Twas not on deck, for there I'm sure he'd never showed his nose. He would not read the Bible, it warn't good enough for him. The course we steered by, that he said, would lead us all to sin. That we were damned and hell would gape, he often would us tell. I know that when I heard his jaw, it made me gape like hell. A storm came on, we sprang a leak, and sorely were we tired. We plied the pumps, 'twas spell and spell, with lots of work beside. And what d'ye think this beggar did, the trick I do declare? He called us all to leave the pumps, and join with him in prayer. At last our boatswain Billy, who was a thundering Turk, goes up to him and says, my man, why don't you do your work? Avaunt, you worst of sinners, I must save my soul, he cried. Confound your soul, says Billy, then you shall not save your hide. Acquaintance then he made soon with the end of the forebrace. It would have made you laugh to see his Methodisty face. He grinned like a roast monkey, and he howled like a baboon. He had a dose from Billy that he didn't forget soon. Take that, said Billy, when he'd done, and now you'll please to work. I read the Bible often, but I don't my duty shirk. The pumps they are not choked yet, nor do we yet despair. When all is up, or we are saved, we'll join you in a prayer.
And now we'll have one from the other side of the house, said Moggy, as soon as the plaudits were over. Come then, Anthony, you shall speak for us, and prove that we can sing a stave as well as honester men.
With all my heart, William. Here's my very best. The smuggler then sang as follows. Fill, lads, fill, fill, lads, fill, here we have a cure for every ill. If fortune's unkind as the north-east wind, still we must endure, trusting to our cure, in better luck still. Drink, boys, drink, drink, boys, drink, the bowl let us drain, with right good will. If women deceive, why should we grieve, forgetting our pain? Love make again, with better luck still. Sing, lads, sing, sing, lads, sing, our voices we'll raise. Be merry still, if dead tomorrow, we brave all sorrow. Life's a weary maze, when we end our days, 'tis better luck still. As the wounded men occupied the major part of the lower deck, and there was no accommodation for the numerous party of men and women on board, the carousing was kept up until the next morning, when at daylight the cutter was run into Cherbourg. The officers who came on board went on shore with the report that the cutter belonged to the English government, and had been occupied by Sir Robert and his men, who were well known. The consequence was, an order for the cutter to leave the port immediately, as receiving her would be tantamount to an aggression on the part of France. But this order, although given, was not intended to be rigidly enforced, and there was plenty of time allowed for Sir Robert and his people to land with their specie and baggage. Ramsay did not forget his promise to the corporal. He went to the French authorities, stated the great importance of his forwarding a letter to Amsterdam immediately, and that the way it might be effected would be very satisfactory. That, aware that King William was at the Hague, they should write a letter informing him of the arrival of the cutter, and that his Majesty might not imagine that the French government could sanction such outrages, they had sent her immediately on to him, under the charge of one of their officers, to await upon his Majesty, and express their sentiments of regret that such a circumstance should have occurred. The authorities were aware that to obey Sir Robert would not be displeasing to the court of Versailles, and that the excuse for so doing could only be taken as a compliment to the English court, therefore acted upon this suggestion. A French officer was sent on board of the cutter with the despatch, and Ramsay's letter to Mynheer Krause was committed to the charge of the corporal. Before the sun had set, the Yungfrau was again at sea, and on the third morning anchored in her usual berth off the town of Amsterdam. End of chapter 54. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 55 of Snarleyyow by Frederick MARRYAT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In which we trust that everything will be arranged to the satisfaction of our readers. The French officer who was sent to explain what had occasioned the arrival of the cutter in the port of Cherbourg immediately set off for the Hague, and was received by Lord Albemarle. As soon as his credentials had been examined, he was introduced to His Majesty King William. "It appears," said His Majesty to Lord Albemarle, after the introduction, "that these Jacobite conspirators have saved us one trouble by hanging this traitor Vanslyperken." "Yes, your Majesty, he has met with his deserved punishment," replied Lord Albemarle. Then addressing himself to the officer, "We will return our acknowledgments for this proof of good will on the part of the French government," said His Majesty, bowing. "My Lord Albemarle, you will see that this gentleman is suitably entertained." The officer bowed low and retired. "This is an over politeness which I do not admire," observed His Majesty to Lord Albemarle. "Let that person be well watched. Depend upon it, the letter is all a pretext. There is more plotting going on." "I am of your Majesty's opinion, and shall be careful that your Majesty's commands are put in force," replied his lordship, as King William retired into his private apartments. The cutter had not been half an hour at anchor before Obadiah Coble went on shore with the corporal. Their first object was to apply to the authorities that the wounded men might be sent to the hospital, which they were before the night. The next was to deliver the letter to Mynheer Krause. They thought it advisable to go first to the widow Vandersloosh, who was surprised at the sight of her dear corporal, and much more enraptured when she heard that Mr Vanslyperken and his cur had been hanged.
"I'll keep my word, corporal," cried the widow. "I told you I would not marry until he was hung. I don't care if I marry you to morrow."
"Mein Gott! Yes, to day."
"No, no, not to day, corporal, or to morrow either. We must wait till the poor fellows are out of the hospital, for I must have them all to the wedding."
"Mein Gott! Yes," replied the corporal. The widow then proceeded to state how she had been thrown into a dungeon, and how she and Mynheer Krause, the syndic, had been released the next day; how Mynheer Krause's house had been burned to the ground, and all the other particulars with which the reader is already acquainted. This reminded the corporal of the letters to Mynheer Krause, which he had for a time forgotten, and he inquired where he was to be found. But the widow was too prudent to allow the corporal to go himself. She sent Babette, who executed her commission without exciting any suspicion, and made Mynheer Krause very happy. He soon made his arrangements, and joined his daughter and Ramsay, who had not, however, awaited his arrival, but had been married the day after they landed at Cherbourg. Mynheer Krause was not a little surprised to find that his son-in-law was a Jacobite, but his incarceration and loss of his property had very much cooled his loyalty. He settled at Hamburg, and became perfectly indifferent whether England was ruled by King William or King James. Ramsay's marriage made him also less warm in the good cause. He had gained a pretty wife and a good fortune, and to be very loyal a person should be very poor. The death of King James in the year following released him from his engagements, and as he resided at Hamburg he was soon forgotten, and was never called upon to embark in the subsequent fruitless attempts on the part of the Jacobites. As it was necessary to write to the Admiralty in England, acquainting them with the fate of Mr Vanslyperken, and demanding that another officer should be sent out to take the command of the Yungfrau, a delay of 3 or 4 weeks took place, during which the cutter remained at Amsterdam. For Dick Short and Coble were no navigators, if they had wished to send her back, and moreover she had so many of her crew at the hospital that she was weak-handed. It was about a month after her arrival at Amsterdam that every soul belonging to the cutter had gone on shore, and she was left to swing to the tide and foul her hawse, or go adrift if she pleased, for she had to take care of herself. This unusual disregard to naval instructions arose from the simple fact that on that day was to be celebrated the marriage of Widow Vandersloosh and Corporal Van Spitter. Great indeed had been the preparations. All the ingenuity and talents of Jemmy Ducks and Moggy and Bill Spurey, for he and all the others were now discharged from the hospital, had been summoned to the assistance of the widow and Babette in preparing and decorating the Lust House for the important ceremony, which the widow declared King William himself should hear of, cost what it might. Festoons of flowers, wreaths of laurel garlands for the ceiling, extra chandeliers, extra musicians, all were dressed out and collected in honour of this auspicious day. The whole of the crew of the cutter were invited, not however to feast at the widow's expense. Neither she nor the corporal would stand treat, but to spend their money in honour of the occasion. And it must be observed that since their arrival in port, the Yungfrau had spent a great deal of money at the widow's, which was considered strange, as they had not for some time received any pay. And it was further observed that none appeared so wealthy as Smallbones and Corporal Van Spitter. Some had asserted that it was the gold of Mr Vanslyperken, which had been appropriated by the crew to their own wants, considering themselves as legitimate heirs. Whether this be true or not, it is impossible to say. Certain it is that there was no gold found in Mr Vanslyperken's cabin when his successor took possession of it. And equally certain it was that all the Yungfraus had their pockets full of gold, and that the major part of this gold did ultimately fall into the possession of the widow Vandersloosh, who was heard to say that Mr Vanslyperken had paid the expenses of her wedding. From these facts collected, we must leave the reader to draw what inference he may please. The widow, beautifully dressed, a white kersey petticoat, deep blue stockings, silver buckles in her shoes, a scarlet velvet jacket with long flaps before and behind, a golden cross 6 inches long suspended to a velvet ribbon, which was attached half-way between the cross and her neck, a large gold heart, gold earrings, and on her head an ornament, which in Holland and Germany is called a zitternabel, shook and trembled as she walked along to church, hanging on to the arm of her dear corporal. Some of the bridges were too narrow to admit the happy pair to pass abreast. The knot was tied. The name Vandersloosh was abandoned without regret for the sharper one of Van Spitter, and flushed with joy, and the thermometer at 96, the cavalcade returned home, and refreshed themselves with some beer of the Frau Van Spitter's own brewing. Let it not, however, be supposed that they dined tête-à-tête. No, no, the corporal and his wife were not so churlish as that. The dinner party consisted of a chosen set, the most particular friends of the corporal. Mr Short, first officer and boatswain, Mr William Spurey, Mr. and Mrs. Salisbury, and last, although not the least important person in this history, Peter Smallbones, Esquire, who, having obtained money somehow, was now remarkable for the neatness of his apparel. The fair widow, assisted by Moggy and Babette, cooked the dinner, and when it was ready, came in from the kitchen as red as a fury, and announced it. And then it was served up, and they all sat down to table in the little parlour. It was very close. The gentlemen took off their jackets, and the widow and Moggy fanned themselves, and the enormous demand, by evaporation, was supplied with foaming beer. None could have done the honours of the table better than the corporal and his lady, who sat melting and stuck together on the little fubsy sofa, which had been the witness of so much pretended and so much real love. But the Lust Haus is now lighted up, the company are assembling fast, Babette is waddling and trotting like an armadillo from corner to corner. Babette is here, Babette there, it is Babette everywhere. The room is full, and the musicians have commenced tuning their instruments. The party run from the table to join the rest. A general cheer greets the widow as she is led into the room by the corporal, for she had asked many of her friends as well as the crew of the Yungfrau, and many others came who were not invited, so that the wedding day, instead of disbursement, produced one of large receipt to the happy pair. "Now then, corporal, you must open the ball with your lady," cried Bill Spurey. "Mein Gott, yes." "What shall it be, Madam Van Spitter?"
"A waltz, if you please."
The musicians struck up a waltz, and Corporal Van Spitter, who had no notion of waltzing, further than having seen the dance performed by others, seized his wife by the waist, who, with an amorous glance, dropped her fat arm upon the corporal's shoulder. This was the signal for the rest. The corporal had made but one turn before 100 couple more were turning also. The whole room seemed turning. The corporal could not waltz, but he could turn. He held on fast by the widow, and with such a firm piece of resistance, he kept a centrifugal balance. And without regard to time or space, he increased his velocity at a prodigious rate. Round they went, with the dangerous force of the 2 iron balls suspended to the fly wheel, which regulate the power of some stupendous steam engine. The corporal would not, and his better half could not, stop. The first couple they came in contact with were hurled to the other side of the room. A second and third fell, and still the corporal wheeled on. 2 chairs and a table were swept away in a moment. 3 young women with baskets of cake and nuts were thrown down together, and the contents of all their baskets were scattered on the floor, and "Bravo, corporal!" resounded from the crew of the Yungfrau. Babette and the 2 bottles of ginger beer were next demolished. Jemmy Ducks received a hoist, and Smallbones was flattened to a pancake. Everyone fled from the orbit of these revolving spheres, and they were left to wheel by themselves. At last Mrs Van Spitter, finding that nothing else would stop her husband, who, like all heavy bodies, once put in motion, returned it in proportion to his weight, dropped down, and left him to support her whole weight. This was more than the corporal could stand, and it brought him up all standing. He stopped, dropped his wife, and reeled to a chair, for he was so giddy he could not keep his legs, and so out of breath that he had lost his wind. "Bravo, corporal!" was shouted throughout the room, while his spouse hardly knew whether she should laugh or scold him well. But it being the wedding night, she deferred the scolding for that night only, and she gained a chair, and fanned and wiped, and fanned and wiped again. The corporal, shortly afterwards, would have danced again, but Mrs Van Spitter having had quite enough for that evening, she thanked him for the offer, was satisfied with his prowess, but declined on the score of the extreme sultriness of the weather, to which observation the corporal replied as usual, Mein Gott, yes. The major part of the evening was passed in dancing and drinking, the corporal and his wife, with Babette, now attending to the wants of the customers, who, what with the exercise, the heat of the weather, and the fumes of tobacco, were more than usually thirsty, and as they became satisfied with dancing, so did they call for refreshments. But we cannot find space to dwell upon the quantity of beer, the variety of liquors which were consumed at this eventful wedding, with which we wind up our eventful history, nor even to pity the breathless, flushed, and overheated Babette, who was so ill the next day as to be unable to quit her bed, nor can we detail the jokes, the merriment, and the songs which went round, the peals of laughter, the loud choruses, the antic feats performed by the company. Still more impossible would it be to give an idea of the 3 tremendous cheers which shook the Lust Haus to its foundations, when Corporal and Mistress Van Spitter, upon their retiring, bade farewell to the company assembled. The observation of Jemmy Salisbury, as he waddled out, was as correct as it was emphatic. "Well, Dick, this has been a spree." "Yes," replied Dick Short. End of chapter 55. End of Snarleyyow. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.